Thanks to the new Nikon Z mount, we can now use Sony lenses on RED camera bodies. But just how well do they work, and is it even reliable in a real-world scenario? Well, I've been testing out the new Z mount RED Komodo X with some Sony lenses for the past week, and I thought I would make this video to share my findings on the overall autofocus performance, the functionality, and the face detection autofocus with this combination. First, I want to give you a little bit of context about where I'm coming from, because I think it's going to help sort of frame my opinion and help you begin to form your own opinion. So outside of this YouTube channel, I shoot a lot of documentaries. Usually I'm by myself, but sometimes I have 1 to maybe 3 other people. This can be both as a personal project overseas or locally. And professionally, I'm shooting a lot of corporate and doc style stuff in a government setting for my day job. I use Sony cameras every single day in all of these scenarios. I own an A7S III, an FX30, and I work with an FX6 as well. So I'm very familiar with Sony's autofocus system and the reason why it's a lifesaver. I've also owned an OG RED Komodo for the past 2 years, and it does not have usable autofocus. That camera purchase made sense for my business and the client work I was doing, and I've sort of kitted it out to fit a documentary style workflow. Now, the autofocus on the OG RED Komodo is certainly something that I missed, but in my opinion, the trade-off with the image quality made it worth it, and I think the modularity of the camera kind of added to the flexibility to where I was able to use it in a lot of documentary settings. So now fast forward to RED adding the Z mount on the Komodo X and being able to add Sony lenses with them. You might be saying to yourself, hey, I'm a Sony shooter. I have Sony E-mount glass. Is this something that I could add to my workflow and be able to use pretty seamlessly? Well, the simple answer is yes, but it's definitely a little bit more complicated than that, and your scenario might be slightly different than mine. The fact is that Sony E-mount lenses do work on the new Z mount RED Komodo X, and it's super encouraging. The manual focus works, and the focus pulls with the lenses are fairly linear. I would say that they're about as responsive and linear as they are on Sony camera bodies, which is nice to see. The iris control works, and there's even data being passed back and forth between the camera and the lens. You can read the lens information with the specific model number, and even the individual serial number is showing up on the Komodo X camera body. So I know that they're talking to each other, and for me this is encouraging to see because it opens up some possibilities in the future with just added functionality, or maybe even something like lens corrections being added to RED Cine X down the line. Autofocus performance with the touch to focus box works pretty well also. The touchscreen interface is pretty easy to navigate, even on the small HD Cine 7, which is great for someone like me who hasn't upgraded to the RED version of this monitor. And the new menu for opening the autofocus gives you quite a few options. You can select continuous, which I think probably makes the most sense in most scenarios. And then you can even customize the focus box and shape, and then just tap to be able to tell the camera where to focus. Most lenses are going to have the option for both speed and sensitivity, and so you can kind of dial this into your liking. One of my lenses, the G Master version 1 of the 24-70 lens, only gives me the option for sensitivity, so it might vary lens to lens what options and control you have specifically on the lens. To activate face tracking, you're going to go into the menu and select Focus System, enable face detection, and under No Face Found, you're going to want to select Revert to Focus Box. Now there are a couple of options besides Revert to Focus Box, And they might be helpful in certain scenarios, but I've found them to be pretty frustrating because you don't have the ability to move the focus box unless you disable the face detection mode. And so when you're in face detection mode, I think that enabling revert to focus box is helpful, because then when the camera isn't able to find a face, you have control over where the focus box is going to be set, and you can sort of override the face detection on the camera and kind of guide the autofocus system. So this is what the face tracking mode looks like, and I'm recording it on my Cine 7, and as you can see, it's locked onto my face. The box turns green when it indicates that it has focus set, and I think for the most part, it does like a decent job of tracking me. And I think that in a situation like this where I'm recording like a talking head to YouTube and I'm not planning on moving around that much, but I might have a little bit of movement as I talk, I think it's probably going to be reliable as it is. If you are filming someone that is going to be moving around a decent amount, it is going to struggle to keep up a little bit. And so as you can see, if I move far enough where I'm outside of the box, the camera lags behind maybe by a half second or so, and it's going to start to rack to the background, and then it'll realize that I'm out of the box and it needs to follow me. Now, this certainly isn't going to be every interview subject, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. And I think that if Red were to add object tracking, I think that this would really help improve this performance, because right now the camera doesn't have built-in object tracking, and so it's not like intuitively, this is a total guess, but I don't think it's like intuitively tracking the shape of my head. And so when I move, it is kind of looking for the face, and it struggles to keep up. On Sony cameras, they have object tracking, and so I feel like if it loses sight of a face, then it at least is going to probably track the head or the body and be relatively close. With where it is right now, there is potential for some frustration to happen, because I'm moving like a foot or so, maybe a little more than a foot, and at times it's going to struggle to keep up. The performance also seems to be relatively similar across the different lenses that I've owned and tested, and so I don't think it is necessarily a lens issue. I also have the sensitivity turned all the way up in hopes of making the face tracking more sticky, and that doesn't seem to help the performance right now. This is obviously like the first version of firmware on the new Komodo X with face tracking, and so my hope is that as this gets fine-tuned, it's going to improve. I don't think it would take a whole lot for this to really be able to improve and kind of follow me just a little bit faster and a little bit snappier. My guess is that the Z-mount lenses are a little bit snappier, but I guess I'll have to rent some of those and test those out, which I definitely want to do here in the near future. I think that if you're in the unique position of wanting to use E-mount lenses on a Red camera, there is a good chance that you currently own a Sony camera body that has good autofocus. And I think if you're in that situation, I probably wouldn't encourage you to sell your Sony camera body to fund your purchase of the Komodo X, unless your client work was like really shifting that direction and you were willing to give up most of the conveniences of autofocus. But because you potentially have Sony camera bodies already, I don't think that there's a need to stress about the gap in autofocus. You already have the right tool for the right job, and fortunately, most of the functionality with Sony lenses, things like image stabilization, manual focus, and iris control, they're gonna work fine for the most part. The only issue that I've noticed in terms of kind of basic functionality outside of autofocus is when a lens doesn't have an AF/MF switch. It seems like the camera can't distinguish whether or not it's supposed to be giving it the manual focus option or an autofocus option. But outside of that, I think that I can say with a reasonable degree of certainty that the Sony branded E-mount lenses are going to work on this camera body without a ton of issues, and I think that the autofocus performance is an added bonus. I think it's a matter of understanding what this camera is meant for and having the right expectations for this tool. For me, as a documentary shooter who loves the image quality and modularity of RED, this is a huge bonus. The RF mount Komodo was exclusively a manual focus camera for me, and I could see the Z mount Komodo X making interviews, controlled gimbal shots, and even some documentary style B-roll easier to capture. And if it continues to develop, or the Z mount lenses add on to this, I think we could see the Komodo X be somewhat of an FX6 competitor in terms of usability, but that's probably an overly optimistic hot take. As you can probably tell, I'm pretty optimistic about the future of RED and where things are headed. But if I'm being honest, if there's no improvements from here on out and this is all we got, I would still be happy because the ability to use my lenses across all of my camera bodies is something that just makes life so much easier. All right, I'll catch you guys in the next one.